but they're really after money. They don't really want the fame, you know?
What happens when one of music's most legendary minds quietly despises the bands everyone else worships? Bob Dylan, poet, prophet, and provocateur, has never been afraid to speak his mind. But behind the mystery and sunglasses, there were grudges, rivalries, and moments of raw contempt. These weren't just musical differences, these were personal. Let's dive into the 6 bands Bob Dylan hated the most, and some of the reasons might just blow your mind. And hey, if you're into music stories no one else dares to tell, make sure to subscribe. Number 1. The Beatles. At first glance, you'd think Bob Dylan and the Beatles were a match made in musical heaven. Both were voices of their generation. Both rewrote the rules. And yes, Dylan famously introduced them to marijuana during a surreal meeting in New York City in 1964. But behind the camaraderie was something else: resentment. Dylan wasn't impressed with the Beatles' early hits. I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You. To him, it was shallow teenage fluff. He saw his own music as protest, poetry, pain. The Beatles? Pop for the masses. And even as their sound matured, Dylan's criticism only shifted, not softened. He reportedly mocked Michelle and Yesterday as commercialized ballads built for mass approval, and he hated the idea that the media started calling them revolutionary. In Dylan's eyes, they hadn't earned that. He once told friends bluntly that the Beatles were just copying me. And Paul Simon wasn't the only one accused of imitation. Dylan believed Lennon was borrowing his lyrical style, McCartney chasing his melodies, and the band as a whole benefiting from a wave he had started years earlier, without the credit. Even John Lennon seemed to feel the tension. In interviews, Lennon often danced around Dylan's influence, respectful but cautious. In private, he admitted Dylan had a sharp tongue and a cold stare that could silence a room. Their mutual admiration grew over time, especially as the Beatles disbanded and Dylan mellowed. But in those early years, the tension was real. Beneath the surface of a historic friendship was a rivalry Dylan never truly let go of. Number 2. Kiss. Bob Dylan wasn't the type to call out bands publicly, but every now and then he'd drop a line that said everything. During a mid-70s show, Dylan looked out at the crowd and muttered with dry sarcasm, "If you want rock and roll, go see Kiss." It wasn't a compliment, it was a dismissal, sharp and deliberate. To Dylan, Kiss represented the exact opposite of what music should be. They wore face paint like warriors, lit up stages with fire and blood, and built their brand around spectacle. For fans, it was exhilarating. For Dylan, it was empty theater. He believed music should move you, not just distract you. And Kiss? They were showmen with fireworks, not poets with purpose. It wasn't just about taste, it was about values. Dylan had spent years in coffee houses and smoky bars, turning verses into weapons. Meanwhile, Kiss was rising on makeup, marketing, and merchandise. He saw them less as a band and more as a brand. There was no direct feud, no interviews slinging mud, but Dylan's one-liner cut deeper than any headline. In just 10 words, he exposed his disdain for an entire genre of glammed-up, overproduced rock. And he wasn't done shaking the pillars of modern music. Number 3. Led Zeppelin. It happened backstage in 1974. The moment was brief but unforgettable. Peter Grant, the towering, intimidating manager of Led Zeppelin, extended his hand to Bob Dylan in a rare meeting between two titans. Dylan didn't take it. He didn't say a word. He just stared, cold, silent, unmoved. It was more than just an awkward moment. It was a message. Dylan didn't hand out respect easily, especially not to bands that, in his eyes, stood for excess over essence. And Led Zeppelin? They were the kings of sonic excess. Sure, Dylan acknowledged their talent. He wasn't blind to Robert Plant's golden vocals or Jimmy Page's ferocious guitar work, but he couldn't connect with the grandiosity, the mysticism, the almost religious adoration surrounding them. Zeppelin didn't play songs, they summoned epics. Dylan, by contrast, built stripped-down sermons laced with jagged truths. Their music, with its layers of distortion and mythic storytelling, felt like theater to Dylan. Impressive, yes, but distant from the human struggle he poured into his own work. He didn't hate them out of jealousy, he just couldn't relate. Plant once said that Dylan was the first word and the last word in songwriting, but that didn't mean the feeling was mutual. Dylan kept Zeppelin at arm's length, and that handshake he refused, it became a legend in itself. A moment where one musical god quietly rejected another. And yet Dylan's next rivalry wasn't with a band that was trying to out-rock him. It was with a band trying to out-folk him. Number 4. The Rolling Stones. At one point, Dylan praised the Rolling Stones as the best rock and roll band in the world. But with Dylan, compliments always came with a sharp edge, and sometimes they came right before the storm. In 1995, that storm broke live on stage. Dylan had been invited to perform with the Stones. Fans expected a legendary collaboration, but what they got was an uncomfortable train wreck. Timing was off, chemistry was missing, and the crowd could feel the tension. When Dylan walked off stage, he flashed them the middle finger. The message was unmistakable. Behind the scenes, Dylan's patience with the Stones had been wearing thin for years. He couldn't stomach Mick Jagger's over-the-top strutting, the leather pants, the tongue logos plastered across every arena. To Dylan, it felt fake. He once described Jagger's persona as a parody of rebellion. And though he respected Keith Richards' guitar work, Dylan saw the Stones' evolution into a massive, global brand as a betrayal of their roots. They had started as raw blues revivalists, but to Dylan, they ended up chasing fame with flash. It wasn't just about the music, it was about authenticity. Dylan had built a career on being difficult, uncompromising, and brutally honest. The Stones, with their stage pyrotechnics and sponsorship deals, had become rock's ultimate showman. He didn't hate their success, he hated what it represented. And as he watched the Stones soar through stadiums, Dylan kept walking the other way, guitar in hand, mumbling truths into a harmonica. But perhaps no rivalry cut as deep or got as personal as the one that came next. Number 5. Simon and Garfunkel. It happened in a small club in Greenwich Village, long before fame had touched either camp. Simon and Garfunkel took the stage with their delicate harmonies and carefully polished lyrics, and sitting in the audience was Bob Dylan. Midway through the performance, Dylan laughed. Not politely, not quietly, loudly, and without apology. He thought it was pretentious. The sweetness, the precision, the poetry, it all sounded like theater to him. Where was the grit? Where was the pain? Dylan's songs bled. Simon and Garfunkel's? To him, they were dressed up in nice clothes and made to look pretty. From that night on, the rivalry lingered like smoke. Paul Simon, ambitious and fiercely proud, was often compared to Dylan in reviews, especially as he began writing deeper, more introspective material. That comparison irritated both men. Simon wanted to be respected in his own right. Dylan? He saw Simon as a shatter trying to copy his stance. Insiders from the folk scene whispered about the tension. There was no public war, no dramatic fallout, but the air between them was always thick with competition. It wasn't just style, it was ego, it was legacy. Dylan's fans viewed Simon as polished, maybe even safe. Dylan was dangerous, unfiltered. Paul Simon may have sung about the sound of silence, but Dylan had been screaming truth into a mic long before the world listened. The rivalry never turned violent, but it never softened either. Dylan never forgot that performance, or how hard he laughed. And yet, the most unexpected fallout of Dylan's career came not from rivals, but from a band he actually shared the stage with. Number 6. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers.
On paper, it sounded perfect. Two American icons joining forces for a global tour. Bob Dylan and Tom Petty. Legends of lyricism, heartland rock, and raw storytelling. The 1986 to 1987 tour was supposed to be unforgettable, and it was, but not for the right reasons. Behind the scenes, Dylan was miserable. He later admitted in an interview there was no connection. Everything was smashed. That wasn't just about the music, it was about the energy, the chemistry, the spirit. The Heartbreakers were tight, professional, and meticulously rehearsed. But Dylan, he thrived on chaos. He needed room to fall apart and rebuild on stage. Petty's structure felt like a prison. The audience couldn't always tell. The shows were successful, the crowds were huge, but Dylan felt lost inside the machine. He once described it as just playing over and over again, like a jukebox. And for someone who reinvented himself almost every year, being trapped in repetition was a kind of creative death. Petty himself later admitted that the tour had its problems. He respected Dylan, even admired him, but they were different animals. Where Petty chased perfection, Dylan chased imperfection. The tour turned into a clash of approaches, one searching for polish, the other gasping for freedom. By the end of it all, Dylan felt drained, disconnected, like a ghost in his own career. The tour ended, and with it, any illusion that Dylan could truly share creative control. He didn't leave with hate, but he left with clarity. Some paths weren't meant to merge, not even with friends. Even legends have their limits, and Bob Dylan never held back when something didn't sit right with him. Whether it was polished pop, over-the-top glam, or creative tension, these 6 bands pushed him too far. If you want more raw stories like this, hit that like button and subscribe because we're just getting started.